Grave mistake to miss this bonus episode, so lift your spirits up for architecture, coffee, and ink. Hello, this is Hollywood Z, and you're listening to Architecture, Coffee, and Ink, a podcast dedicated to introducing concepts, detailing out designs, and tackling the architecture you might not realize the meaning behind. I'm your hostess, and I'm here today to start introducing you to the designs that make you wonder why. So I ask you to brew your coffee, grab your sketchbook and pen, and let's begin. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Architecture, Coffee, and Ink. I'm your hostess today, and here to talk about architecture, case studies, and concepts. To those new to the show, or those who have been listeners since the very beginning, I am excited to be joining you all once again. It was so great to be back with everyone again, and I'm very excited to kick off the beginning of the highly requested World of Religious Architecture bonus series, or maybe architectural religions, architecture by religious design, real architecture. By the end of the series, I will have a better phrase to describe this. Actually, please feel free to email me a suggestion for a better name. I have been working on the series off and on for the past few weeks, ever since I first mentioned it in December or January. Ironically, this was the last episode to be written and a last-minute addition to the series, even though it is coming first. I was literally finishing up writing and researching this episode moments before I started to record, so I guess this is your warning about that. First, for all my newer listeners, or even those who have managed to sleep since I first spoke about this idea, let's talk about what this bonus series is about. Then, let's introduce the episode. So this series, or side project, is based on listener request. I am always happy to work through and include any suggestions. Though I do have a bit of a backlog of requests, I will do my best to fulfill them. The series is focused on introducing and discussing the 12 classical religions of the world. This number is based off of the larger classifications like Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, etc., not based on the subsects underneath those religions. In addition to those, there are several requests for some ancient or no longer practiced religions to be possibly included as well. So what the final number of episodes will be is currently up for debate. And we will add on an episode for atheistic architecture as well. But after briefly introducing those religions, each episode is actually going to focus on the architecture, historical sites, and landscapes associated with them. We are going to dive into discussing the similarities, puzzling through the symbolism, and debating the various ways each architecture captures the essence of the principles. With this in mind, please remember, this podcast is dedicated to sharing, educating, and crafting a positive environment that celebrates cultures and promotes diversity and seek to learn from those around us. While I may joke around, I only come from a place of complete respect for each topic that we come across. But always remember, check your sources, check your facts, and more importantly, check me. I shouldn't be your primary source of information, and always encourage everyone to seek out additional information when possible. But on this episode, I realized that the best way to kick the series off isn't to dive straight into the topics, but instead to focus on how various cultures treat and interact with their dead. Now, I know many of you are probably asking how this relates to architecture, and the truth is a lot more than you think. The afterlife, or what comes after death, oftentimes acts as a form of deterrent for bad behavior, or the religion itself acts as a form of moral codes, guidelines, and beliefs that help shape the way the practitioners view and behave in the world. And here I am speaking through an extremely generic terms and summary about all of the religions. Throughout history, we have designed places of worship and ritual, and many of those places include honoring the dead or promoting the soul's journey through the afterlife. There are many variations and motivations that have sprung from the various ideas and concepts throughout history. Additionally, a lot of these places work as a way of honoring the dead, bringing peace to the living, and promoting peace, hope, and symbolism at trying times. One of the most meaningful discussions I ever taught to this point in time was the idea of immortality in architecture. I was extremely lucky to be working with a group of extremely polite and professional young minds who were actually the reason I started an interest in this topic. Now, while we started down this path I'm going to be taking you down today, they ended the conversation thinking about whether architecture itself should be immortal, whether or not someone is capable of achieving immortality through architecture, and whether or not architecture was capable of imparting lessons or moral guidance. So, as I work through these concepts, think about that question. Should architecture be, or is architecture considered immortal? Now, before I kick us off with our first concept and case study, I do want to let everyone know that while I am talking about cemeteries and cities of the dead, among other topics, my focus is on architecture. I will not be getting graphic. I am not here to creep anyone out, unlike my Halloween or cryptid episodes. So please use your best judgment when deciding if this episode is for you. To understand this topic, we are going to be traveling through a few methods of cemeteries. In America, our public schools will oftentimes have an ancient cultures phase in elementary school or primary school. And during it, we learn a lot about ancient Egypt, Rome, and Greece, and the pyramids, and ideas like that. So in an effort to avoid repeating the same information over again, I am not going to be talking about those. Instead, I've picked out several topics that I will discuss. Now, there are honestly hundreds of others I could have chosen, but I feel like this is the best variety without creating a whole extra episode. Up first is the concept of hanging cemeteries, which is actually practiced in several locations around the globe, though the most commonly mentioned one is in Sagdia in Echo Valley, Philippines. It is also practiced in China and Indonesia as well. So this is the practice of laying individuals to rest among the sides of cliffs. While the variations will change from culture to culture, overall the practice has the same concepts. Once somebody passes, they are placed in a coffin, and the coffin is then hung on the side of the cliff. Now, when you look at and view the site, it'll look like a series of boxes, sometimes decorated, sometimes not, and they'll either be mounted to some boards or attached with ropes. And those boards are oftentimes secure into the mountainside. Within the context of the landscape, it is both unobtrusive and protective. The majority of the locations are sheltered from the elements, and the access by wildlife is severely limited. Now, let's focus on each of the three countries and discuss the differences. The Igorot tribe in the Philippines is the most well-known and popular culture. In fact, I remember watching several documentaries on this location for school, and I only remember watching a single fantasy film at a film festival that mentioned the one in China. But here, this practice is believed to have been started long before colonialism reached the American continent. This is a dying tradition. But those who practice will carve their own coffin, or families will assist when health prevents them. There are limitations and requirements to being able to partake in this ritual, and an alternative is to utilize the caves nearby. The caves and mountains are full of limestone, and the coffins are stacked. The body is positioned in the fetal position to mimic birth, And the higher the location, the closer they are believed to be to the gods. So the more important you are, the higher your body gets to be, the closer you are to the gods. In China, it was most famous by the bow. However, unlike the Philippines, there are currently no surviving members. They have been found throughout several provinces, sometimes in caves and other times alongside the walls. The bow were the most famous as they were the unfortunate victims of a genocide underneath the Ming Dynasty around 1573, barely 400 years ago. Given this, the majority of the websites had a lot of speculation about the whys and the hows that this was achieved. Many of the people were buried with artifacts, treasures, and remarkably well preserved, as many of the sites and locations were almost impossible to climb now. Indonesia followed using a coffin called an arong, which is traditionally sheltered from above by an overhang and is high enough to prevent looting. Again, the position alongside the cave shows how important they were and what they achieved. Again, here, the idea of the caves being a more common backup and for those of lesser importance. One thing I noticed immediately between the three cultures was how some used carved caves in the rock face and others used exclusively natural. The similarities between height and protection, indicating importance, and the social contribution pops up within all three cultures. And within all three cultures, the play between the landscape and the coffins is the design. It allows the spirit's movement and freedom, and through the subtle differences creates hierarchy. The next subject is the Qin Tomb, which is also called the mausoleum of the first Qin emperor. And this is one you have undoubtedly heard about. The emperor is named Qin Shi Huang and was born in 259 BCE and died in 210 BCE. He was known for creating the first empire of China, as in the United China. His empire actually collapsed and would be replaced after him, but modeled after what the Qin dynasty set up. He was also extremely important as he was the one who began to piece together what would become the Great Wall of China, using a mixture of walls, fortifications, and linking them all together. So overall, someone who had an extremely strong impact on both architecture and modern life. He will inevitably end up on another episode at some point. However, it is a tomb that we are interested in right now. So he started the project during his lifetime and created what ended up being a 20 square mile or 50 square kilometers tomb, or actually tomb is an understatement. It was actually more of a complex or compound, one that was lost until 1974 when it was rediscovered by farmers. Among the many treasures held within the tomb was well over 1,000 terracotta warriors. The thing is that the terracotta statues actually extended beyond soldiers and included horses and were incredibly complex, detailed faces. Also modeled and included among there were roofs, pavilions, offices, tombs. So when I say it is bigger than a tomb, you can understand what I mean. The whole thing was designed to mirror his capital city, which was Ziyang. The terracotta army was carefully placed, faced to defend the emperor, and positioned in the actual direction his enemies were in, meaning that they would have been able to protect him in this life and the next. This is actually now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and as such, there are plenty of maps and documentation available. There is also plenty of photography, even of the broken ones. Despite the incredibly well-designed fortress, some pieces and artifacts were damaged through both the degradation of time and also a fire and several other events. Next is the City of the Dead, which is another name for the New Orleans cemeteries in Louisiana, USA. New Orleans is a city with an internationally renowned character, known for its food, music, my favorite coffee brand, and the resilient people who call it home. While it has multiple examples of distinctive and beautiful architecture, it also has another well-known trait. Since it is below sea level, the city has had to adapt. Being so low, attempts to bury people resulted in the holes being filled with water while they were attempting to dig. And as my old professor loved to describe, caskets floating down the streets during floods. Due to this, they decided to shift to burying above ground. However, unlike the hanging coffins, they chose to do this with mausoleums and tombs. Looking down the rows, there are a lot of iron fences and what some kids I was teaching described as tiny houses. So it is pretty easy to see where they get their nickname, Cities of the Dead. Like many intercity cemeteries, overcrowding can be a problem, so laws and legislation has been put into place to combat that. Of course, everyone listening is probably most familiar with this through any ghost tour, ghost adventure, Zach Baggins show, voodoo movie, or TV show. These cemeteries are incredibly picturesque in a way. The tombs showcase definitive architecture and traits, and the carvings are often have a juxtaposition of macabre beauty with the styles of tombs changing per century. Now, if I had time to go into more details, normally I would expand on the variations in the New Orleans cemeteries. Instead, I want to finish with a mention of the Tomba Brion by Carlo Scarpa, located in San Vito del Voli, Treviso, Italy. This is actually the newest project that we are talking about, and it was built in 1968 to 1979 as an addition, and he did several other projects that would also fit into this episode. However, the reason I chose to finish on this project is both because he is buried nearby and also because of a quote I found that he said about his work here. And I'm going to read his words before I describe the project. So this is a direct quote, and I got it from archives.com, but he says this rather long, quote, I would like to explain the Brion Cemetery. I consider this work, if you permit me, to be rather good and which will get better over time. I have tried to put some poetic imagination into it, though not in order to create poetic architecture, but to make a certain kind of architecture that could emulate the sense of formal poetry, that the place for the dead is a garden. I wanted to show some ways in which you could approach death in a social and civic way, and further what meaning there was in death, in the ephemeral of life, other than these shoe boxes. Place of death is little like a garden. Incidentally, the great American cemeteries of the 19th century, in Chicago, for example, are extensive parks. No Napoleonic tomb, no. You can drive in with your car. There are beautiful monuments, for instance, those of Lewis Henry Sullivan. Cemeteries now have become more piled up shoeboxes, one on top of the other. I wanted to express the naturalness of water and meadow, of water and earth. Water is the source of life. Again, that is Carlo Scarpa's word taken from archives.com. So for me, this project is the clearest conjunction of architecture, garden, and somber reflection. There is an incredible use of water, grass, and forms. Comparing this to the Qin complex, this modernist design inspires minimalism, where an emperor kept ornate detail, and yet the vastness of the space is filled by the architecture where the terracotta soldiers filled the tomb. Details, richness, and wealth is conveyed through the patterns, where the previous space was filled with forms. This is concrete and covers an area of 22,000 square meters. It reminds of a Frank Lloyd Wright a lot, but the circle arches throughout contrast strongest against the linear aspects that creates the majority of the composition. Now, another thing that I've noticed about this particular project is that there's a lot of play with stacked squares and rectangles, I think is the best way to say it. So throughout the form, there's a series of repeated elements, and each of them is kind of the stair shape is the best way to describe it. When I first saw this building, it actually reminded me a lot in one particular corner of the building of Mayan architecture. And so this kind of timelessness about this form, where you really can't tell what period of time it is in some ways. You can tell it's modernist. It screams modernism. But then when you're inside the building versus when you're outside the building, for me, that's an incredibly different read of the place. And then the subtle use of quiet pops of color is a really interesting form. And when you look at the floor plan, and I think this is what really struck me across the three, or all of the projects that we talked about today, is that there's a lot of gridding in its own way. And the idea of shoeboxing and piling up things is a constant that comes across all of our case studies today, that everybody is trying to rebel or do more than just put everyone into shoe boxes. There's a rather delicate nature to how everyone is choosing to handle these forms. And there was multitudes of ways that we could have continued this subject today. But some of my later episodes, when I go into the different variations of religions in different ways, I'm actually going to continue this concept and this idea of the immortality of architecture. And I'm not even including this little bit on the blog itself because I would really like to avoid influencing my listeners too much. I want to know what your opinion is on it. Should we achieve immortality through forms? And that is all we have time for this episode. But once again, a big thank you to all my listeners. Please rate and review. If you liked it, loved it, hated it, let me know. I love feedback and hearing from everyone, and more importantly, sparking conversation. We again have a Facebook page and private group, both of which are under the same name, Architecture, Coffee, and Ink, which is again a pretty young podcast. ArchitectureInc.design.blog is the blog/website that I am completely revamping right now. I have set a hard deadline for myself to get that sorted out, or else somebody's going to outsource it. So wait until I announce either on the Facebook page or in an episode when it is finally finished. Let's see what else. Oh, and the email is architecturecoffeeandink@gmail.com, all spelled out. And I keep forgetting to mention that. Someone wrote in and told me that trying to find the email in episodes is sometimes like playing Where's Waldo and I Spy by ear. So I will work on getting better on mentioning that more. But it is always listed in the show notes. And please feel free to send me art, letters, suggestions, firms, projects, whatever. I love hearing from everyone. But signing off as always, may your coffee mugs be full and your inkwells never run dry.